Hey, Vince.
Hello, everybody.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to ApprenticeSIP. I'm Luther Jackson, one of the co-organizers, along with Anita Gay and Orion Willis. And for those of us who are in education, workforce, community-based organizations, we're absolutely excited about the last few years of apprenticeship growth. We're totally sold on apprenticeship. But going forward, one of the things we need to do is see a little more excitement from employers, particularly now that the market seems to be down a bit in the tech world. So I'm really pleased to report that our friends at the Northern California Apprenticeship Network are on the case. And Cam Clausey is joined us today for the second time. And it's going to talk about NCAN series of boot camps to educate and inspire employers. And Cam's been at this work for 7 years, and it's a good friend of Apprenticeship, so it's great, Cam, that you can join us. Just a brief agenda. I'll lead us in brief introductions. Cam will do an overview, and then we'll look forward to a dialogue with all of you. And Anita will wrap us up in time to be done at 5:30. The only ground rule we have is that please use the raised hand function if you want to speak, and I'll recognize you. So I think we're in good shape. Let's do the intros. Cam, why don't you start?
I'm Cam. I've been working on apprenticeships here in the Bay Area for the last 7 or so years, and you'll hear a lot more from me, so I'll pass it off
Great.
to Stone, who hasn't been here in a while.
Hey, yeah, it's been a little while. Just thought I'd check in. I'm going to be in transit, so I won't be able to talk too much. But yeah, worked in apprenticeship for a while. Have been working on some other stuff, but yeah, checking back in.
Great to see you, Stone. Let's go to Orion.
Yeah, great to hear from you, Stone. Actually, as a fellow founding member of the NCAN, so it's appropriate to have you here today. Good to hear your voice. Orion Willis. I work for the City and County of San Francisco and helped get this meetup off the ground years and years ago. I'll kick it over to Harry, one of our newest members.
Hi, all. Nice to meet you. I'm Harry Leach from Apprenticeships for America. I've been working on apprenticeships for a long time, but almost exclusively in the UK, and I've just started at Apprenticeships for America. And so yeah, looking forward to getting to know you and learning more about apprenticeships in California.
Thanks, Harry. Good to see you. Temple.
No title, just a long-time apprenticeship member, but I do know a heck of a lot about apprenticeships. So because I've partook in them, quite a few of them when I was younger. Okay, so who am I missing? Erwin. How about that? Erwin Jankovic? I guess not. How about Vince Kohler?
Hey, hello, everybody. Vince Kohler, Social Policy Research Associates. My title for the day is apprenticeshipologist. So that's an ethnographer who documents apprenticeship. And I'm excited that this group is still going strong. And I think it's time, sometime in the near future, to do one in person again with some actual sipping going on. So I'm voting for that.
Great to have a historian in the crowd here.
And I'm in the other Bay Area, the Monterey Bay Area.
Thank you. Anita.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Vince. I've been pushing for an in-person meeting for a little while now, so let's make it happen. I'm Anita Gay. I'm with Bayback Media. We're a 45, almost 50-year-old arts nonprofit, and I've been an apprenticeship intermediary for several years now. And yeah, happy to be a co-host of Apprenticeship.
Great. Joelle?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here. My name is Joelle Hanson. I'm the Director of Workforce Developments and Grants here at the Metropolitan Education District. We are a regional occupation training center for high schools, but we also have an adult education program. So the next step is trying to get some pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeships going over here. So thank you.
Thank you. Mike?
Good evening, everybody. Mike Roberts. I am the founder of Creating Coding Careers. We are a high intervention intermediary. Very excited to be in the company of all of these folks that are just as passionate as I am about apprenticeships. I'm also a software engineer by trade and a CTE instructor here in California. And so super excited about bringing more apprenticeships and work-based learning to our younger folks, as well as we serve a lot of transitioning service members with our Skill Bridge program, which we combine with apprenticeship. So lots to, again, sort of pick other people's brains within this group. I'm super excited to be here and member of SCAN and a member of Apprenticeship for America. So I want to make sure, give shout outs to all these other wonderful organizations.
Thanks so much, Mike. Deborah.
Hi, good afternoon, whatever it is now. And unfortunately, if you do in person, I doubt I'll be there unless you come south. I'm in Los Angeles with the South Bay Workforce Investment Board, and we have been involved with apprenticeship, and thanks to Orion and many of you, working with the grant community to be a technical hub to assist anyone in found SCAN thanks to our northern folks. So we do have a Southern California chapter. If anybody wants to tune into those, you are more than welcome. We meet the second Thursday of the month at noon. And hopefully we can help with our grant funding and our expertise and the people that we have met for this group.
Thanks, Deborah. Annalise.
Thanks, Luther. Hi, everybody. My name's Annalise, and I'm a fellow at Brookings, but formerly co-founder of this lovely group. And so I'm always happy to jump in and learn about what's going on these days back on the West Coast.
Thanks, Annalise. Good to see you. Rick.
I'm Rick Raffey. I'm a technologist who's been consulting on pathways for underrepresented groups into technology careers. And I'm specifically working with Mike at Creating Coding Careers these days. So I've met most of you guys through various interactions, either around Mike or around policy.
Thanks for joining us, Rick. Erwin, can you hear us?
Yep.
Could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Erwin Shankovic. I worked for the Metropolitan Water District for 20 years, launched the apprentice program there 20 years ago, and continue to be interested in apprenticeships.
Thank you. Cam, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much. This is really fun. I'm going to quickly share my screen. I've made a little deck for visuals. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Luther gave an awesome little agenda. This is what I wanted to cover today. So really quickly, just touching on kind of the problem that we're dealing with here with trying to get more employers to start programs. And then really what I wanted to do today is talk about two different case studies of examples of folks who have brought groups of employers together to try to start new apprenticeship programs through events. And one of the case studies you'll see is very different from the other one. I was a part of the second one. So I'm going to give some more kind of insider look and feel as to what it was like in the room. And yeah, just really approaching this from the standpoint of like, I don't think anyone has really cracked the code on how to get employers to start more programs in the US. It's still a really, really tough problem. So just to be on my deck. The problem is really how do we get employers to start and commit to apprenticeship programs? And in this case, again, looking at doing it in groups and what are the benefits of bringing folks together in order to get new programs launched. Just to jump in really quick to Michigan. So there's a group called Advanced Michigan Center for Apprenticeship Innovation, or AMCAI for short. And they started this program called Registered Apprenticeship in a Day, otherwise known as RAPID or RAPIDS. We have so many acronyms in the apprenticeship world. So this is another kind of one I found myself chuckling about, just because the acronyms get so long and so amazing sometimes. So background context on this group. This group was founded in 2015. From my vantage point, they're pretty enormous. They have 9 community colleges, 6 workforce development boards, covering 37 counties, mostly in South Michigan. So this is like a group that really came together in a big way. And they were awarded a $4 million American Apprenticeship Initiative grant in 2015. They did a report that basically touched on kind of the results from their grant. And some of it is a bit vague, so you'll have to hang in there with me on like, so they had 2,205 participants, and they were able to get 642 registered apprentices and 414 new employers. So to me, what I read out of that, I put here as kind of a just quick, back of the napkin math equation, is they got 414 employers to do a pilot of an apprenticeship, which resulted in basically 1 to 2 people, most likely per company, doing an apprenticeship. And for me, that's really important because it says to us, part of the work that we're doing here is trying to get folks to dip their toe in the water and try a pilot in a really scoped and defined way before they start to scale a lot bigger. And so the other thing that stood out to me about this particular case study in Michigan is just that they had such a broad budget to run with this. I'm under the impression that folks' salaries and expenses and things like that were not included in this report, which, by the way, I'm happy to share out sources for this information in the follow-up emails. But I was pretty amazed that they're putting essentially like $10,000 into getting one new employer started with an apprenticeship in a grant of this size. Roughly, like, again, I think it's probably a little bit more than that because it's probably not including salaries and expenses, but like a very well-funded venture here. The way that they structured this this model is basically doing an informational session first. In the report, they talk really heavily about how do you basically get an employer very, very familiar with apprenticeship in advance of showing up to the group. And I'll talk about my experience doing this shortly, and I cannot emphasize that enough either. I'm sure all of us have done, one-on-one meetings or even group meetings with employers in their offices, like in safe space where they are able to share their concerns and fears and blockers about these types of things. And yeah, can't emphasize enough that they should not be going into this not understanding expectations or understanding the ask that's made of them, and really just being as familiar with the registered apprenticeship process in this case as possible. And then they basically do a secondary workshop where they're just completing their standard. So the Michigan group talked about doing, for the most part, only 5 employers per event. They said that they did up to 15 employers in an event. So small, like keeping it as small and nimble as possible is what got them to, the 400 plus scale that they were able to reach. And then they also mentioned, and my experience has also been that having more than one person from each employer is super key. So you don't want all of the burden of communicating and reporting back to the company about the findings and the next steps to be on just one single representative or employee. So they recommended having more than one person. And format wise, the way that they did this was having the Department of Labor really kicking things off, focusing on Appendix A, which for folks who are more familiar with registered apprenticeship than I am, hopefully that's something that you all are aware of. For me, as someone who's not as familiar with registered apprenticeship, my background's more in unregistered tech apprenticeships. I was surprised that the initial kind of kickoff is focused on the paperwork really more than anything. And then the thing that I thought is potentially the most valuable and the most complex is that second presentation where they're bringing in their workforce development board. They also implied that in some cases, like if the employer is working in a different county or with a different workforce development board, that they would separate the employers based on which board they needed to speak with. So I think one of the things that really stood out to me about this particular model is that they really focus on giving every single employer a table and giving them really, really custom experiences. So while this might seem like it's, just the workforce development board talking at the group, I got the impression from this report that it was really like more working at a table, kind of one-on-one, and figuring out like a braided funding strategy for the employer that's like custom to them. And then doing a break and basically doing more one-on-one time with a specific, like they called it like an apprenticeship expert. I assume it might be an employee who works with registered apprenticeship on a regular basis to basically finalize the work process schedule and the related training. And what's interesting too about this format is they actually get the employer to sign everything, and they almost announce it like a graduation with photo ops and press. So I found at least a couple of instances where they actually put the event itself into local press. It wasn't necessarily like the photo ops of like who signed and is like committed to doing an apprenticeship, but it was kind of showing that this is possible in a day and that more businesses locally should get involved in doing this sort of event. And I thought that was pretty interesting as a means of accountability. So just like some quick kind of summaries of this, like for me, the positives of a model like this is obviously they had a ton of funding, a lot of partners involved. The coverage of like the whole southern part of the Michigan state is pretty incredible, at least from my vantage point. And then relatedly, the scale that they were able to, over the course of this grant, get 400, like more than 400 employers involved, to me is just like really incredible. And then, over 2,000 participants. It's really pretty cool. For me, on the like kind of deltas or like things that I find myself wondering that maybe would change is whether or not signing a standard is like the right thing to be kind of putting out into press and putting out into the community as being the accomplishment. Because to me, I go back and forth whether or not that's the accomplishment or whether, actually hiring the apprentices, like maybe the apprentices signing their offer letters, something that's more clear what the impact is. I also still, just to be very vulnerable and honest, still struggle with standards as like a accomplishment that, to me, it seems like we could have a standard library. It seems like there's a lot more standard libraries coming out where, you just choose your occupation and you go with the standard that's kind of predefined. So for me, I struggle a little bit with the standard part of it, because I find myself hoping that the employers can just pick that up and run and keep going, because that part, at least for me, feels more procedural and more like a checkbox that just has to be done. and then the impact comes really a lot more after that. So that to me is one of the things that stands out about this model. And then the cost, I think I go back and forth, like how much should this cost per new apprenticeship or per new employer? $10,000 per, or like a little under $10,000 per new employer. I was like, wow, that's, it's definitely an undertaking. And then the thing that felt like it was lacking from this model is kind of the light at the end of the tunnel, or the inspiration, or in some cases, I always joke, like the peer pressure of like, here's another company that's doing this amazingly well. And so there's no excuses. Like, here's the way that you can learn how to do this effectively. Here's some of the best practices, the learnings that others have implemented. But at least in my experience, making sure that folks see other employers that are already succeeding. It addresses the cultural issues that tend to come up where folks are stuck in their heads about maybe biases, or not believing that things can be affordable, not believing that things can be productive, or they're not believing that people can be productive. So like, I tend to see a lot more light bulbs go off when there's evidence that there's a different way and that it's already working for someone else. It's kind of undeniable at that point. So I found myself wondering how this model incorporated other employers who are already doing a great job. And then the second case study is one that, like I said, I was a part of in 2017, totally different scale. This was here in the Bay Area. So this was a team that I was a part of here in San Francisco. We were just 3 people with full-time jobs who it definitely directly benefited our company to have more companies starting apprenticeships, because we wanted to get our graduates hired into the apprenticeship programs. But as you'll see, we had a very small budget, less than $5,000. And then just as background context for how this happened, because I think it's, this to me is like a testament to how much you can get done with only a little, even in the worst environment. So Dev Bootcamp was founded in 2011 originally. At the time that we did this event, it had 100 employees in about 6 campuses around the US. And Kaplan had acquired Kaplan had acquired Dev Bootcamp in June of 2014. So we were owned by a very well-known, respected education company. But ironically, in the process of planning this event, Kaplan announced that they were going to shut down the entire company. So all the campuses, all of the employees were getting laid off. And it was really shocking to the industry, because Dev Bootcamp kind of created, bootcamps are called bootcamps because of Dev Bootcamp. And so to know that such a respected, valued brand was just going to completely shut down, even though it had 6 campuses and tons of students. Sorry, this is incorrect. It was not 2015, 2017. So like basically the month before we started doing this this event. So it was already planned. We already had some employers on board, but you can imagine like a lot of concern about like, are we still doing this event? I think it unfortunately called into question our legitimacy in some ways, but we're still able to do so much. And so that's kind of the backdrop for this event. Very scrappy, like I said, very little budget. We had 30 participants, so a little bit less than 2 participants per employer. It's still very hard for me to know whether or not the number of apprentices I could estimate is correct. So I didn't want to commit to a number. And I think everybody here is probably familiar with the models that I'm going to talk about for the tech apprenticeships. So I'll go into a bit more detail about the number of apprentices that this impacted later. And yeah, it was about 20 new employers involved in this particular roundtable. So we did it as 3 hours, so just a single day, really a half day. And we provided about a 15-page toolkit that basically summarized some of the things that we facilitated, which was, what is an apprenticeship? Why is an apprenticeship important? Who is an apprenticeship important to? What benefits does it bring to your company? We gave some models of like, here's some examples of how Pinterest started theirs, of how Airbnb piloted theirs. Here's some metrics, and then also some local suggested partners of like who you could work with to start an apprenticeship program. So it essentially was just this one event, and then a follow-up packet of resources about how to start an apprenticeship program. And then like if we get into the agenda of the 3 hours, we did a topic specific breakout that we called kind of choose your own adventure. We were kind of doing an experiment to see if the employers who did not have an apprenticeship yet would want to go talk and listen to the folks who already had an apprenticeship. And so that was a really interesting time to kind of see whether they would basically focus on all of their blockers and the things that were going wrong. Because one of the groups kind of did that. And then another group was really talking about hiring apprentices and like getting the work done. And we let the employers choose regardless of where they might be in the journey. And then the second breakout was more stage specific. So really getting into, again, those blockers, and it was basically separated in a pre-assigned way based on whether they had a program already or whether they didn't have a program. And then we did some really great drawings on a whiteboard of kind of highlights from group discussions and bringing to light. I think it was really important to basically show employers, here is some things that folks have said are concerns and worries. And then here are some companies in the room who have already solved this. And to show both of those things in the same room was really kind of magical. So to get into the details of what this looked like at the time, again, this was in 2017. So we had Pinterest that had been running their apprenticeship program for a couple of years. It was still pretty small, not so different than it is now. I think it's still roughly the same size. They do, depending on their commitment each year, I think 5 to 10 apprentices per cohort and maybe 1 or 2 cohorts a year. It was roughly the same as that at this time. Adobe Digital Academy was pretty big. They were doing these fully paid, they were actually, and I think they're still doing this, but they were actually paying for folks to go through a coding boot camp. So their commitment monetarily was shocking to a lot of the folks in the room because they were actually paying to put folks through training and investing very, very upfront. Whereas for a lot of these other tech boot camps, it's a lot more common that they want to see that the person has an aptitude for coding and is able to get themselves through to a certain point. And so, for example, Intuit's program and LinkedIn Reach's program, they both hire folks who have already gone through a coding boot camp. And then Thoughtbot is really interesting. They're more of a consulting company, but they've had one of the longest standing national tech apprenticeships. And so they were kind of in the room representing hey, we've done this in tech for 8 years already. And so they kind of represented the longevity. And then LinkedIn had just launched Reach. So, and it was pretty exciting because they, if anybody remembers, they had originally announced that they were going to do 15 apprentices in that first cohort. And then they released this, at the time for me, it was this bombshell, amazing article that was we found so many incredible people. We couldn't hire just 15. We ended up hiring 25. And I don't think that they had come out that 80% had converted, but they were close around this time. And so they were very enthusiastic, and they were just like really demonstrating the model in a new way that was just so inspiring. And then you had Airbnb and Uber that had both done a small pilot and were not super successful. So Uber had apprenticed like roughly 8 software engineers, and I think like 1 or 2 converted in that first cohort. It was really brutal. If you're familiar with the history of Uber, this was shortly after the Susan Fowler article that was very explosive about, you know, kind of bullying and harassment in tech and being a woman in tech, like not being in inclusive environments. And so Uber was like really committed to changing itself because it had dealt with this big PR meltdown, but they were still really struggling with a lot of growth too from a technology perspective. And so that was just really tough. And then Airbnb had done a really small pilot program that was led by a recruiter who was doing this like, you know, out of the goodness of his heart and his commitment as a first generation college grad. And he partnered up with a VP of engineering that they just, you know, got through it and like did it from their bootstraps kind of thing. And they did have some more success, but it was hard for them, I think, to figure out how to keep the funding going internally. It's what I'm again, not internal to these organizations, but as an external observer, that's kind of what the vibe was outside. And so both of those programs were kind of like hands off, like we don't know what we're going to do next. We're kind of nervous. And then Twilio, Slack, Lyft, Pandora, Salesforce, and Snapchat were all in the room at this event. And it was kind of brewing, basically. Like they're debating. I would say Twilio was by far the farthest during this event at like really starting to put pedal to the metal to get things going. And so that was really inspiring. If anyone's familiar with Vivek, he was kind of getting galvanized during this moment. And then we had Reddit, SAP, Snagajob, Ellie Mae, Pivotal Labs, and Thumbtack in the room for varying reasons that I won't go into. Those folks kind of stayed where they were. Mike, you probably have the most familiarity with Pivotal Labs, but they had a culture that I thought like they were going to be the first ones out of the gate to get more apprenticeships together. I do think, now that I'm thinking about it, I think they might have actually done a program as well. But they, I think, have since kind of shut down or merged. And so they as a business kind of didn't get to see their full impact come to light. But basically what you had happen after this event was a consolidation of like Uber and Airbnb. And when I say after, I mean, this took probably a year for things to keep progressing. And so I don't want to make it seem like any of this happens overnight, but over the course of a year with increasing, I think, attention on apprenticeship and more folks really committing to it as a model, we saw Uber and Airbnb kind of recommit to their models, and then Twilio launched Hatch. Shortly after, Slack launched the Next Chapter program, and then Pandora launched their mixtape, which I built with my past company OnRamp. And Snapchat has a really incredible model down in LA. And so if you've ever heard of Snapchat Academies, they kind of in some ways borrowed from, I think, what Adobe did with Adobe Digital Academy, and they kind of call it a similar name as well. And so for me, this was like some incredible results. I was really proud that our team of 3 people in these circumstances could get this kind of result from an event like this. And in terms of like things I thought were really great, again, the impact for me, like it felt like we did a lot with a little. And then the thing that stood out to me the most about this event and the way that we held it was that we focused on having some employers in the room who we knew were having really, really successful outcomes, along, like in the room, listening to and talking with folks who we knew were struggling a bit more, at various stages. So like either struggling to grow and scale their program or struggling to get one off the ground as a pilot. And that's one of the things I still debate today is like, should you separate folks by stage? Should you have them in these mixed environments where they see kind of the grass is greener on the other side and it exists and it's possible? And then Delta's, funding and scale. This was obviously like a much more grassroots effort and wasn't as huge as the Michigan one. And then also we didn't have any like direct partners in the room. We had one recruiting tool that we partnered with to get a little bit more funding as a sponsor, but they were not like working on apprenticeship at all. So all of our partners were basically folks that we recommended in our toolkit as like recruiting partners or schools that folks could work with. And so, like I said, I don't want to get too much into like, I have all the answers. This to me is the hardest problem in apprenticeship is, again, in the US especially, is like, how do you get more employers committed to this? And so what I'm spending my time reflecting on now as we're getting geared up to launch these new boot camps, what I'm thinking about is basically like, how do we create urgency and accountability in productive ways? So just making sure that we celebrate the right things in the right places, and that in the instance that there are commitments that are made, that those continue to be upheld or that there are updates. So for example, like Luther and I, when we first hopped on, we're talking about the fact that like, Twilio had this commitment of 100 apprentices, and unfortunately during this most recent economic downturn, like laid off their staff and to my knowledge, like have stopped their apprenticeship program. And so part of it is also kind of accountability to those types of employers that, hey, we want to get you back, into this. What do you like? What resources do you need? How can we help? And then secondarily, the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging environment. For me, it just feels very different. I don't know why. And I'm saddened that it seems to be something that folks are getting increasingly exhausted by or something, but I don't necessarily see commitments the way that we saw certainly during like the summer with George Floyd, during COVID. It's just not a lever that I see pulling companies as strongly anymore as it did in these years past, in 2017. The other thing that's just really changed is the announcements of layoffs all the time. Like, how do you talk about apprenticeship in a way that's sensitive to talent acquisition or recruiting teams that really are struggling and like don't have requisitions open, or maybe have just gone through layoffs? It's just really hard to talk about hiring in an environment where you just can't anticipate whether or not a layoff is coming. And so that's been pretty tough. And then I think on the back of everyone's mind is really like AI and some of the products with LLMs, at least in my world in tech. It feels like, oh my gosh, like how are these things going to change how we work? And will my job be the same? Will an apprenticeship be the same as we learn to use these tools in new ways with our work? So that's what I'm spending my time thinking about, but I really would love to like turn it over to the group as much as we can. Let me stop sharing my screen. Because I think all of us have so many different perspectives on these issues. And I'm super passionate about getting new employers into these rooms. So yeah, hope this is informative. Like I said, I'm happy to share the reports from this that I was referencing.
Thanks so much, Cam. To kick off, Deborah, you had some questions in the chat. Did you want to start with those?
Do you want to just read them, or you want me to read them? They were,
Go ahead.
Go ahead and read them if you don't mind.
Okay. Let's see, there were a few questions here. So I think you're referring to the first session, right, in Michigan.
Yes.
Did the info session happen the same day as the workshop?
I got the impression no, that they were kind of separated by two different stages. Maybe one of the next speakers we could have the folks from Michigan. Because I'm certainly curious to ask them a lot of questions about for like things that were not in this report that I would be so curious is like the types of employers that they were working with, the size of the employers that they were working with.
And that relates to some of my questions. Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, they didn't really share any names of employers that were in the room. They haven't done an update to this work either in terms of like how it's progressed now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that would be so important to know, is there progress now? Did the pilots lead to anything? And also when they put people in groups, we had done that with our sector partnerships, but they don't talk. Competitors don't talk too freely.
Yeah.
Now maybe they would about this because it's a little bit outside. And in fact, when we presented it to our newest, what we call flex groups, the Space Flex group, about the only thing they could agree on when we talked about the concept of apprenticeship and where were the benefits and just training in general, the only thing they could agree upon was working with the colleges and universities to help, promote the types of programs they need. That was it.
Interesting. So they didn't agree on like the standards or on the length of the program,
or even the use. Right now, we had maybe eight or so companies in the room, and I'd say that one is on its way to doing something, an apprenticeship. One is kind of in between, and the rest are like, I don't know that I was there.
Yeah. I think the thing that's interesting about the Michigan case study too is that they had, over 2,000 participants, but still about 400 employers. So that the yield of like how many people fell off is still, it's like, I think we have to give ourselves as professionals like grace and know that that's kind of the funnel that is just going to happen. That not all organizations are ready or have the culture or the will, and like, I think the longer that I've been in the space, the more that I've had to check myself that some of this stuff is just really out of our control. So I think the 400 employers to me is still incredible, even though they have, 2,000 participants. And that's kind of where I try to like celebrate the wins, basically.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting if they could analyze what industries have picked it up the most.
Yes.
And what kind of numbers do they have today, umpteen years later, post-COVID, et cetera?
Yeah, I know that they've gotten a lot more grants of this size. So hopefully they would, I'm sure the DOL, because it's a DOL grant, gets, more updates than the public does. But yeah, I agree. I think it was Orion who originally showed me this project, and I find it so fascinating as a model. So
it is.
I would definitely keep if you're nerdy like I am, like what Vince was saying, like a anthropologist of apprenticeship, like the Michigan model is definitely one I keep my eye on a lot. Harry, what were you gonna add?
So I had a couple of reflections question. A couple of reflections from how it works in the UK. I'll try and not do this in future, but I've only just got here, so it's very fresh in my mind. Firstly, I think what you said on standards is really, really interesting. So internationally, that's how it works. You have like a common set of standards. You don't work through each one individually. It's, plug and play. An employer and a sponsor just picks it off the shelf. I think the good news is that the DOL is looks like it's moving in that direction. They're moving towards a framework where you can have kind of more, well, they're updating a registration framework so you make allowances for shared standards, which will make things easier. And yeah, more generally on the kind of employer awareness side, it's really interesting to see the kind of two case studies. What strikes me is it's incredibly intensive activity, right? And you know, for the kind of scale that we need to get to, like what's involved. Like if you took that Michigan example and scaled that up, it's enormous. Like let alone the cost, just the activity. I guess what I'm interested in. I mean, in the UK, how we manage this is like, you know, carrot and stick. Like carrot, huge amount of activity, talking to employers, selling the benefits, you know, talk about productivity benefits. Carrot, we tax them. And you have to spend that on apprenticeships, which basically my question is, have you got the sense of like at what stage employers are dropping out? You know, is it awareness right up front? Is it when they learn a little bit more about registration? Is it sort of right before the finish line? At what stage are we losing people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I could speak from my perspective, but I also think that there's like so much wisdom in the room. My answer would be that it varies so much depending on the industry, varies on the stage of the company, even the environment, like how their industry is doing right now. I can speak to at least what I've seen in tech in the Bay Area. You definitely see a big fall off at that awareness, the awareness level. Similar to what Michigan's reporting, like, you know, over half are falling off where they're not starting a pilot. I would say like that's the typical time frame that or not time frame, but like that's the typical funnel that I tend to see as well. And the way that I tend to think about it as someone who's like sold apprenticeships for a while now too, is like I tend to like plant a seed and then hope to see the seed start to grow within the year. I kind of like mentioned that when I was talking about the 2017 event, that I almost never expect a company to turn around very quickly to buy into doing an apprenticeship. And so part of the strategy that I was following before was, okay, can we plant enough seeds and like kind of turn it into like a little garden where like you're just harvesting over time. But yeah, I agree with you 100% that the big lever that we're missing in the US is the apprenticeship levy. It's not surprising to me, for example, that like Multiverse really launched and got pretty big shortly after the big changes in the apprenticeship levy. So yeah, there's a lot of policy stuff that I would change, but I'm curious others' perspective on where they think fall offs happen. I'll say I think in the tech industry too, it's pretty common, like I mentioned, like Airbnb and Uber, like to do a first pilot and to learn a lot, like to just be like, oh my God, okay, let's figure this out again. And I try to be very graceful with folks about that too, that, you know, as long as they get back into it at some point, I think the community is here for them, but we just don't want folks like Twilio is a great example. Like we don't want them to just leave and then never come back. So
yeah, I totally agree that you know, we just somebody new say, let's try it with one or two, see if it works. But on the other hand, and as I think Vince put into the chat, I think we agree, we don't want to be creating multiple apprenticeships if, you know, if one can be written generally enough to be used by multiple organizations and tweaked to the 20% allowable, and ensure that we have more than one employer that would use something new.
I guess one of the things that I'll share is that my experience has been in selling apprenticeship, is that it's often easiest if you can find an internal champion with both decision-making authority and budget, and they can usually greenlight something really small. But that's also where there's a bit of friction because you're asking for a really heavy lift to do something that potentially makes a very small impact on their actual business. And so it really is like the will of that internal champion up against the inertia of all these additional steps. If you go from bottom up, if you go from top down, you may have a CEO that says that, we want to make this part of our DE&I, or we want to make this part of our diversity efforts. Then they may sort of like from the top down say, we're doing this and allocate some budget. But then that's also fraught with all sorts of danger because you don't know if you have the right internal stakeholders. You don't know if you bring the right outside folks in as intermediaries. There's just so much uncertainty beyond just making it work within your organization. And so even organizations that I think do a great job of like piloting it at a small scale and then starting to scale it, and they're really sharp people, can really run into a very difficult first couple of years, and it requires that sustained keeping the senior leadership all 100% committed to it for a good 3-4 years before sometimes you then start to see, okay, now it's taking off, now we can really expand it and get to that like growth. So I feel like it's just a really tough needle to thread, especially right now with all of the other, uncertainty in the economy. I try and, as much as I can these days, just be really empathetic to the enterprise customer and ask them, what are your big pain points? Like, what's the hardest thing for you to hire for? And like, is there a way that we can itch one of those things that's really a cure for a significant business problem versus trying to promote like, willingness to have a new pipeline of talent, all those kinds of things that make them feel warm and fuzzy. But at the end of the day, they don't hit a KPI that's like short term enough for them to want to take some risk on and do things differently. So I know that's kind of a lot. It's all kind of meandering, but I always try and look at it from that like business perspective and not from like even though I run a nonprofit, not from the charity perspective, this has to make business sense and this has to be a right solution for this organization's talent needs. And then they have to be forward thinking about, okay, over the next 5 to 10 years, this is going to make our human capital easier for us to attract and retain. And like, they're just very forward thinking. And that's a lot to expect out of, in this case, in the mission case, I'm just blown away by 400 people signing up. Like that's an enormous volume of organizations to kind of step up to the plate and at least give it a try. So, and 1 or 2, that's phenomenal. If we could get 400 pilots started in a year, some percentage of them are going to succeed, some are going to lose momentum, but that would be I think a significant seismic shift in how we were to do business if we could get that kind of scale here in California.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing that occurred to me is they could be counting employers who created a standard and committed to doing an apprenticeship. And then let's say one employer did 400.
Yeah, which might be more likely. It is interesting that you mentioned that drafting the standard, because that does become, at least in California, that becomes one of the challenges, like getting off, if you're in a non-traditional construction trade, so a moderate apprenticeship, just getting your consultant to understand, like, these are the actual practices of our business, which they may have never seen before, and getting that standard drafted and getting it into them. And then once they actually accept the standard, it still has to post for 30 days. So it's not a you do it at the workshop, you hand it off to someone and you're good to go. Now, maybe with the DOL might process it in like a couple of weeks and you could be off to the races. But to your point about like, is there significance to them getting the standard done like in one shot after they've done some pre-work, they come in, they work on it? I do think that could remove a barrier that I hear from a lot of companies, which is like, I don't even understand like all the rules and pieces and whatnot. And so if you could get them through that in like one window and just be like, look, as long as you're following the same business practices, you're probably not violating any rules if you're in a non-union trade. Let's work on what the competencies and skills are. Let's get those all mapped out. And like, you could be ready to submit this and you could be ready to go. I still think they probably want an intermediary to actually track the way, if they could like get over that hump of like, what is apprenticeship, and just move past it to like, okay, how are we going to leverage this? What do we need to do?
Thanks, Mike. Rick, we'll let you have the last question, and then Anita will wrap us up. Go ahead.
Hey, yeah, it's not actually a question. I would just say, first of all, I echo everything that Mike said, and then I also really find that certain talking points resonate with companies. Kevin Berry talked about this curve with the Twilio work that he did, which is still like one of the great pieces of work as collateral for people to understand the potential value of apprenticeships. And one of the things that he talked about is just this belief that a company that's running well has people on the early end of the curve. They're hiring early career talent. And people that we've been talking to, at one point, I just used the baseball metaphor of a farm team. You know, I don't know how everybody knows baseball, but typically you have your minor leaguers that are ready to come up, so you're not constantly have to pay big dollars for all the people that are already out there making good salaries in baseball. And that metaphor just landed so well with one of the companies that Mike and I are working with. And I really feel like one of the biggest challenges is just how small you have to start, because to Mike's point about the return on investment, you're really starting a movement when you are a champion internally. You're not actually, changing the bottom line in, the first year or three, and so and Vin's is, I was going to give Vin's a lead in, but I'm the last speaker. So he's talked about this just being a challenging product to sell to people from the standpoint of between the friction and the lack of investment. And I'm really hoping that we can work at the policy level there's enough hunger for apprenticeships and tech apprenticeships, especially in California, to get this off the ground, and companies that do it see the value. But we really need to do some things on the policy side at the national and the state level to clean it up.
Thanks so much, Rick. And take a note, folks, of Ben's just put some great information in the chat. Nita, why don't you wrap us up?
Sure. Thanks again, everyone, for a wonderful conversation. It's always so good to see you. These months fly by. But looking forward to our next gathering. We're still finalizing the topic of our next meeting. We also still love the idea of meeting in person. I'm not sure when that's going to be able to happen, but yeah, keep an eye out for the next session's schedule. It's going to be, I don't have it ready on my calendar. It's always the fourth Wednesday of the month. So that makes it June the 26th at 4:30 as usual. And I put a few links in the chat as well. We've got our meetup group that if you subscribe to that, you'll get all the updates from there. We've got a form where you can fill out, give us your thoughts on today's presentation, but also we're always looking for new speakers and new topics. So we really value your input there. So you can fill out that type form. And yeah, we'll see you soon on YouTube as well. This will be recording will be shared on YouTube. I think that's my spiel. Anything I missed, Luther, you think?
Thanks so much, Anita. Thanks, Cam. That was great.
Thank you, everyone.
Good luck with your program.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank
Cam.
you, Cameron.
Yeah, we'll see you soon.
Good to see everybody.
Bye.
Hey.
Bye-bye.
Take care, y'all.